You're listening to Digi City, a cyberpunk story in 10 parts, written by Jarrett Rush and produced by SciFi in cooperation with the author. Part 7, Fortson. Fortson Street was a mess. Not that it hadn't been before, but Miller hadn't expected the broken windows and burned-out storefronts. Fortson used to be home to pharmacies, hardware stores, small markets, the shops that sold the things people needed for life in New Eden. But after the government fell, and the population changed, so did Fortson. The respectable shops moved out, and the sidewalk merchants moved in, everything sold from the shadows. Eventually, the more successful dealers moved into the empty shops, setting up little retail spots of their own. Soon, even though the businesses weren't exactly legit, Fortson looked almost normal again. It had become the home of New Eden's black market. It was where those who had decided to live outside the embrace of Roma would go. They'd buy their tools, their drugs, their food. Of course, they could buy much more than that. Companionship, the opportunity to forget for a few minutes. But mixing the virtues with the vices was the price you paid in the New Eden. And that was the Fortson Street that Miller had expected to find. A place that was a little rough around the edges, but mostly harmless. Noisy crowds brokering deals. The smell of roasting meats coming from vendors' carts. Instead, Roma tough guys acting like street thugs shouted at the people trying to scratch out a living, breaking windows, busting up carts. They had no training in de-escalating a situation. They didn't know what to do when a crowd started to become unruly. All they knew how to do was swing their fists and intimidate. They were second-rate hoodlums who Roma had provided a fancy suit and a little bit of authority. Getting at the worst were the servos, the all-electric ladies who could be anybody's friend for a price. Most weren't surviving in one piece. The tough guys using whatever they could to pull the ladies apart. Arms and legs littered the ground. Torsos with now inanimate heads littered the sidewalk. It was a disturbing sight, and all that carnage filled the air with the smell of burned-out electronics. It mixed with the scent of ash and soot from the burned-out storefronts up and down either side of the street, a combination about as bad as the stairwell in Tallboy. Miller pulled the picture from his pocket and cupped it in his hand. All he knew was that this girl had a place off Fortson. He needed more help if he was going to find her. He scanned the street looking for someone who seemed unfazed by everything going on. He found that guy a few blocks later leaning against the bricks surrounding a broken store window. Glass littered the ground in front of him. Miller approached. "It wasn't me," the guy said. "It wasn't you, what?" "The window. It was like this when I got here." "Sure it was." Miller stepped next to the guy. "But I don't care about the window." "Yeah?" the guy said. "Yeah," Miller said. "You live around here?" "Close enough." The guy stood up a little straighter to match Miller's gaze. Miller put the picture out in front of him. "Have you seen her around?" The guy studied the picture. "Who's asking?" "I just need to talk to her, that's all." The man eyed Miller, saw the pressed pants, the button-front shirt with the collar that laid smooth and flat. He paused a moment. "Just talking?" he asked. Miller nodded. "About 3 blocks down." The guy gestured with his forehead. "You'll see a couple shop windows. One still good, the other burned out. Her door is in between those." Miller found the windows, as the man said. The door was narrow, and it opened to a skinny stairwell. The stairs were built at a shallow angle, ending at the second story. Miller took the steps one at a time, cautious. He stepped off the stairs and toward the first of 2 doors on the second floor. It was slightly open. Miller pushed it with a boot and looked inside. A dark, empty apartment. Noises came from the unit next door. Miller banged on the door. "Hello in there. Open up. We need to talk." Movement behind the closed door. Miller tried to turn the knob. Locked. "Open up," he shouted. "It's Roma." A woman's voice shouted from the other side. "I know who it is." A crash and breaking glass. Miller slammed a boot into the door, his heel hitting near the deadbolt. The door buckled but didn't open. He kicked again. The frame splintered, but the door barely opened. Miller pushed his way into the apartment. Furniture had been shoved in front of the door. A couch, a short bookshelf, a pair of end tables. Miller hurriedly climbed over and around the furniture. Broken dishes and cups crunched under his feet as he reached the window, a small cupboard being the last thing the girl pulled down. Miller climbed out on the fire escape and looked down. The girl was there, dropping to the ground. She threw a small pack over her shoulder and looked up. She smiled at Miller, shot finger guns at him, then turned and walked away. Miller scampered to the ladder and dropped to the second landing. A car waited at the curb for the girl. She climbed into the passenger seat. The door slammed shut. She looked back as the tires squealed. Gone. Miller slammed a palm into the railing and jumped down the ladder to the ground. He ran to the curb, knowing that he'd be too late. The car would be too far gone to see license plates, if the car even had them. The car sped around a corner just as Miller got to the curb. He pulled his hand slowly through his hair. He headed out on foot in the direction the car had gone, hoping for something, but he didn't know what. Fortson was a block over, and he considered going back to see if there was anyone who he could shake a little more info from, like the name of his girl, or who she spent time with. Whoever it was had the ability to get a working car to her on short notice. She wasn't running for small-time operators. She was connected. She was important. Miller stopped at a corner. Wind came in from the bay. It blew cool against his skin and rattled the posters hung on the long-dead streetlight next to him. Miller turned to look. Likely someone hawking a piece of now-useless junk. But this wasn't junk. These were faces. Faces that Miller recognized. Missing was written in a neat block script across the top of one of the posters. A picture of a smiling kid was in the middle. Miller knew the eyes. He could hear the muffled voice. This was the first kid he'd brought to Cruz weeks earlier. A plea for more information and an address were written across the bottom. Miller pulled the poster from the pole, but there was another on the other side. It featured another face Miller recognized and another request for help. Miller pulled that poster too. He held both out in front of him, hoping it was a coincidence that after he took them into Cruz that they both went missing. It could be, Miller tried to convince himself. Cruz never heard Miller come in, his head buried in a reader looking at some report. Roma liked reports. Miller pulled the posters from his back pocket and slapped them down on Cruz's desk. Cruz jumped. "What the hell, man?" Miller kept one hand on the posters. "Where are they?" he asked. "These kids here?" Cruz leaned over and pretended to study their faces. "Appears from these posters that they are missing." Miller smacked the table again. Cruz flinched. "Look again. Look closer. This one." Miller pointed at one of the posters. "He's the first runner I brought in a few weeks ago." Miller gestured to the other poster. "This one, the younger one. He's the third kid I brought in. Why are they missing?" Cruz glared at Miller for a moment. "Why are they missing?" His question was calm. His words were deliberate. "How am I supposed to know why they are missing? Is Roma responsible for this? Is that why they haven't been seen?" Cruz paused before answering. "I don't believe so, no." Non-committal answer that took too long to give. Miller stood up straight. He turned and shut the door. The lock clicked. He stepped back toward Cruz's desk and said, "You're very bad at lying." Cruz flipped one of the posters over and plucked a pen from a mug on his desk. He began scribbling something on the back of the poster. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I don't know where these kids are. And that's the truth. We brought them in. You passed them to me. I passed them to my bosses. What happened to them after that, I don't know." He pushed the poster across to Miller. Miller read it. "Fine. Fine," he said, holding the poster up. "This is fine." Miller grabbed the other poster, folded both, and put them in his pocket. He unlocked Cruz's door and turned back to his boss and started to nod. "Later," he said. "Later." The hours awake and chasing the girl caught up with Miller on his walk home. His legs were lead, and he dragged them up each step on the way to his apartment. Even his keys felt heavy as he tried to work the lock. He collapsed on the couch once he got inside. Carrie came over and sat next to him. "Hi, stranger," she said. She grabbed his left foot and started working to untie the double knot he'd put in the laces of his boot. "You're wiped out." Miller had closed his eyes. He rolled onto his back and put both feet into Carrie's lap. She pulled off his boot. Miller rolled his ankle in a slow circle and let out a long sigh. Carrie began working on the other boot. Miller breathed in deep, surrendering to the exhaustion. Carrie took off his second boot and covered him with the blanket they kept folded over the back of the sofa. Hope started to cry from the back room. Carrie got up to check on her, and Miller grabbed her wrist, pulling her down to give her a long kiss. He looked up at her and said, "Thank you." "For what?" Carrie smiled. "For all of it, taking off my boots, talking with me the other night, for being the woman you are, for loving me." Hope cried out again. "That last one's easy," Carrie said. She kissed Miller's forehead. "I've got to get her." Miller gave her a lazy nod and rolled to his side, letting his mind turn off. Hope's laughter woke him a few hours later. He pushed himself up to sitting and smiled. "How long's she been doing that?" "Just a few minutes," Carrie said. "I'm sorry, we didn't want to wake you." "No," Miller said. "She's laughing." "When did she start laughing?" "Oh, a week or so." "I missed it?" "Yeah," Carrie turned back to Hope. "She's rolling over too. You are, aren't you? You're rolling now. She's growing so much. I'm missing it." "You're doing what you have to do." "Actually." "Yeah?" "I'm meeting up with Cruz in a bit. He and I need to talk about these runners and my time with Roma." Carrie wiggled fingers in front of Hope's face. Hope giggled. Carrie did it again. "You hear that, Hope? Nothing's happened yet, but there's a chance we could see Daddy more." "That's what you're saying, right, Daddy? There's a chance?" "That's what I'm saying." Miller stood. "I've got to go. We aren't meeting at the office." Carrie stood and kissed her husband's cheek and told him to be safe. "I will," he said as he headed to the door. "But this is just me and Cruz. Not much to worry about." Miller was almost out the door when he stopped. He turned and asked, "Seen Chris the last couple of days?" Carrie hesitated, then shook her head no. "Okay," Miller said and shut the door behind him. He got to the street and pulled the posters from his pocket. Generators rumbled, powering lights that lit up the docks. A handful of workers moved cargo onto the ship decks. Miller unfolded the poster that Cruz had written on and held it in front of him. It was an address and a message. "Meet here later. Tell more then." The address was a couple blocks from the Roma headquarters in an area of New Eden that people had started calling the North. It centered around Roma's 12-story building downtown and the businesses that hadn't closed when everything collapsed. The neighborhoods in the South filled with everyone who was naturally skeptical of Roma and its rising power. But those living in the North embraced it. They wanted things to return to normal. They wanted life like it was. Roma was their best chance to get that, so they swallowed hard on all the things that seemed a little odd at first bite. Miller did it for a long time, going along to get along, but Carrie was right. There was nothing noble in that. That was especially true if what he thought had happened to these kids actually happened. His empty stomach turned at the thought. He'd brought them in for Roma, and Roma eliminated them. Neutralized the threat if he were still a soldier. But he wasn't. He wasn't even a cop. He was a glorified security guard sent to muscle some kids back to Roma so someone without a conscience could do the wet work.